Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Midtown Scholar Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Alex. I'm with the Scholar, and as always, I am live in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania at the bookstore. Thank you for tuning in this evening as we welcome historians Ada Ferrer and David W. Blight to virtual Harrisburg. Before we begin tonight's program, I'd like to give a special shout out to our two co-sponsoring partners for this evening's event. That is Dickinson College's Department of Latin American, Latinx, and Caribbean Studies and Department of Spanish and Portuguese Studies. We love our partners who help make this programming possible. So look in the chat room in just a moment and I'll provide a link for you to head to their websites. But at this time, I'd like to introduce our speakers here for this evening's program. Our interviewer tonight is Dr. David W. Blight. David is the Sterling Professor of History and Director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition at Yale University. He is the author or editor of a dozen books, including American Oracle, The Civil War and the Civil Rights Era, and Race and Reunion, The Civil War in American Memory. And most recently, he has published his Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of Frederick Douglass. He has worked on Douglass much of his professional life and been awarded the Bancroft Prize, the Abraham Lincoln Prize, and the Frederick Douglass Prize, among others. Of course, our featured author this evening is Ada Ferrer. Ada is a Julius Silver Professor of History and Latin American and Caribbean Studies at New York University, where she has taught since 1995. She is the author of Insurgent Cuba, Race, Nation, and Revolution, 1868 to 1898, winner of the Berkshire Book Prize for the best first book by a woman in any field of history, and Freedom's Mirror, Cuba and Haiti in the Age of Revolution, which won the Frederick Douglass Book Prize from the Gilder Lehrman Center at Yale University, as well as multiple prizes from the American Historical Association. Born in Cuba and raised in the United States, she has been traveling to and conducting research on the island since 1990. Of course, Ada's new book that we are here for this evening is titled Cuba and American History. I've got to read just one blurb, and of course, I had to pick the one from David Blight, who says, quote, "Ferrer has achieved a page-turning masterpiece of her craft. Rarely is good history this kind of literary performance," end quote. Some quick housekeeping before we get started. First, if you have a question for Ada or David, please use the Q&A button towards the bottom of the screen. It's below our faces here. We'd love to hear from you, so ask away at any point and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible towards the end of the program. And lastly, and most importantly, if you're interested in purchasing a copy of Cuba and American History, we'd love for you to consider purchasing it through your host bookstore this evening, and that is the Midtown Scholar Bookstore. That is the #1 way to support this event series and our programming. So look in the chat room in just a moment and I'll provide a link for you, or simply head to our website at midtownscholar.com. But now, without further ado, Ada Ferrer and David Blight.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Ada. This is a thrill for me to do this with you, Ada. An honor.
It's a thrill for me too, David.
I'm not a historian of Cuba, but I've read enough of you now that I'm getting there. I just want to say a shout out to the Midtown Scholar too. I did a book event there on that Douglass book, I don't know, a year and a half, 2 years ago now, probably. And that is an amazing bookstore you have in Harrisburg. And I can't wait to come back there sometime, incognito, and just, to crawl around and buy some books. Ada, this could have been entitled Cuba, an Epic American History. Now, you left the word epic out of the title. I understand that. It is a big, a kind of classic history of a very big story, but you start with your own personal story. And because it is in the book, or at least some portion of it, I'd love to hear you tell that. You write the book, in fact, in parts of it anyway, in 2 different voices, one a quite personal voice, because this is part of your own experience, and then the historian's voice, which is most of the book. But would you please explain a bit why this is such a personal story?
Yeah, sure. So as I explained in the prologue, I was born in Cuba, in between the Bay of Pigs invasion and the missile crisis. My mother and I left in 1963. My father had arrived in the US a little bit before we did. And I grew up in a place that was full of other Cuban immigrants, and grew up with those stories, with the pain of family separation, of which there was a lot. In some sense, my mother in particular, she didn't go to college, she didn't go to high school, but she was kind of a born historian. And always told me stories of,
Mm.
of growing up, of becoming an adult, of Havana, of the countryside where she was born.
Mm.
Uh, and she used to make recordings where she would recite patriotic poetry and then also sing the chants of neighborhood street vendors. So she
Mm.
was kind of this innate social historian, and I just became obsessed with those stories. I also became obsessed with understanding Cuba and the Cuban Revolution. They were, I grew up in a place where most people were working class, not educated. They were vehemently anti-Castro and had rejected the revolution. And I kind of always wondered why they had rejected it, why most of their family had stayed when they left. So I became interested in these more abstract questions as well. What
Mhm.
makes
Mhm.
people revolutionary subjects? What do people
Mm.
change in a revolution? Does migration change people? So I became kind of interested in all those questions, and then always wanted to travel there to see it because I couldn't remember it. And I did that in 1990 for the first time, and kind of went on two parallel journeys in the way the book is, right? I immersed myself in Cuban archives and libraries for most of my time there, and grew to love doing research there. But I also met my family, and I made my own friends, and I kind of made Cuba, a place I was myself attached to as an individual and as an adult, as opposed to just the daughter of exiles who were obsessed with it. So that's kind of the origin of that parallel story.
It's actually a very deep part of the story, and you can feel it in your prose. It reminded me of an older book by Richard Rodriguez, who in his memoir, he was born in Mexico, becomes citizen of the United States and a major writer. But he talked about having a two-life life. I think he lived longer in Mexico than you ever lived in Cuba.
Yeah.
But he talked about being from there, but coming here, and then having to rediscover what there was.
Right.
And millions of people have experienced
Yeah,
this. This is what
exactly.
immigrants do.
Yeah.
But they don't all become historians
No.
and have to figure out how to tell the story.
Yeah.
Well, I'll spare you the question of just how and why you became a historian, but maybe that'll come out anyway here, because let's get to this incredible story of Cuba's a big island. I mean, it is. You point out that it's as long as, what is it, the distance from New York to Savannah or something
Right.
like that.
Yeah.
It's a very big island, but its history is so turbulent that it's almost an outsized history in its significance, not just in the Caribbean, but
Right.
with the U.S.
Yeah.
And you make the point right up front in the book, and it comes and goes throughout the book. This is a history of Cuba, but it's a history of the United States at the same time. It's an American history of Cuba because Cuba exists in all the Americas, but it's especially tied over and over and over to this place called the United States.
Right.
You are constantly showing us, and not because you want to show us that, it's because that's where the story goes. There's so much of Cuban history that happens in New York City.
Yeah.
After all.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, and I think that was the idea behind the title. I thought initially I thought it might be just Cuba, a history, but that just seemed a little flat or something. And I wanted, and I'm writing it in English, which is the language I write in, even though I'm bilingual. I'm writing it for its first audience, of course, will be people in the United States. So I'm writing it for Americans, and I want them not just to see Cuba differently, not just recognize the importance of Cuba and its connection with the US, but I also think that the fact that the US has had such an outsized presence in Cuban history, right? The fact that the US exists in the world and acts on the world, and in this Cuba, means that looking at the history of Cuba with that in mind actually kind of nudges readers into seeing the US differently, to seeing the US, and I call it in the book, seeing the US from the outside in, through the eyes of another. You get a different perspective on the US if your vantage point is outside the US. And so I wanted to play with that and say, yes, this is a history of Cuba, but it's also this kind of shadow history or this mirrored history of the United States as well.
And it was that way long before the Cold War.
Yeah, oh,
Right?
absolutely.
I mean,
Absolutely.
a lot of us grew up with the Cold War, but this is true of Cuban history.
Yeah.
Well, very early. Well,
Very early on.
let's go back to the early. You have an origin story here that you had to make choices about. I mean, these are tough choices as a historian. Where do you start this story? And I was struck how much you did start with the ironic and at times in your prose quite witty handling of Columbus.
Yeah. Yeah.
Talk about that if you would. Columbus did land in Cuba and a whole bunch of other places, not
Right.
knowing what he was finding.
Yeah.
But then the Spanish take control of Cuba.
Yeah.
For centuries.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Talk about that origin story.
Yeah. So I went back and forth between starting with Columbus and starting with Cuba's indigenous population right from the start, putting them first. And that appealed to me for obvious reasons that, Cuban history doesn't begin with Columbus. It begins with the people who were there before him. So that's clear. But as I thought about from the start, bringing in this perspective on the U.S. and the way to see the U.S. differently,
yeah.
I thought it made sense to start with Columbus because that is also the traditional way that U.S. history started. So you have these two parallel histories, both starting with Columbus. But as I point out in the book, it's really interesting that U.S. history begins with Columbus because Columbus never landed in what became the U.S. Right? So that's right away. I try to get readers to think of the U.S. differently. Well, why does U.S. history begin with Columbus? Columbus was never here. And of course, Columbus becomes the U.S. origin story precisely as American statesmen are beginning to look to Cuba and Latin America as potentially parts of the United States. So it's almost like they want some of these territories to become American. So they grab their origin story and make it their own. So I thought, that was a good way to kind of play with just juxtaposing the histories right from the outset.
I think it worked, and you wrote it in a kind of with a squinted eye. There was a certain delight I think you were having in treating there's a Columbus statue in every town, at least it used to be, but there's not an Aponte statue in every American town or a Masayo statue in every American town.
Right.
But let's talk then about the nature of Spanish colonialism and the ways in which slavery, the Spanish brought slaves, first in a trickle, eventually in huge numbers, to places like Cuba. This is a very old story now, of course. We're starting here in the 15th century. This is through the 16th century, 17th century, 18th century. And modern Cuba didn't happen until the 19th century. But we're talking centuries here of colonialism and a particular kind by the Spanish.
Right. Yeah, well, so Cuba was one of the first places colonized by Spain. And very quickly, though, it becomes a backwater because they find minerals, they find silver and gold in Mexico.
They're always after gold.
Yeah, exactly, from the very beginning.
As you say, follow the gold.
Follow the gold, and that's what they did. So they went off to Mexico and then later to Peru and Bolivia, the Andes. And so Cuba became, especially Havana, became just a place where all that silver and gold from these other prosperous colonies was stored. So this famous Spanish treasure fleet landed in Cuba, and they all gathered there and organized there and outfitted the vessels and then went across the Atlantic. Havana sat right where the Gulf Stream kind of gathers and originates. So that meant that initially Cuba wasn't a slave society in the traditional sense. It wasn't a plantation society. There was sugar and there were enslaved people, but it wasn't the kind of slavery that many people think of when they think about plantation slavery. So that developed more slowly as, I think, well, for two reasons. Increasingly, the Spanish realized that other other nations realized the value of Cuba for that. They realized the
Mhm.
value of Cuba, and it was not in mineral wealth, but in agricultural commodities and
Right.
commerce. And then second, of course, as you know, and this is from what my second book was about, because of the
Right.
Haitian Revolution, which was began in 1791, where the enslaved and free people of color destroyed the institution of slavery in Saint Domingue, which was then the largest producer of sugar in the world. And Cuban sugar planters, and they were Creole, they were Cuban, they were mostly not Spanish by that point, kind of jump in and take advantage of that and begin truly developing a Cuban sugar industry, Cuban plantation society, vibrant slave trade. And so that is a later history for Cuba in the history of
Yeah,
Spanish
I mean,
law.
I'd love to stop along the 16th and the 17th centuries to know more about. I mean, I was struck here because I didn't know this. I mean, these treasure fleets. I mean, we've
Yeah,
always known the Spanish were all about finding gold and treasure,
yeah,
but
yeah,
my God, that's the first Havana
right.
comes about because of these treasure fleets,
Exactly.
and
There would be
for
dozens of
years
them.
and
Yeah.
years, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and they found this gold, especially in Mexico.
In Mexico, it was as well as silver, and then a
Yeah.
little bit later in Peru, they
And the slaves are first brought to work in mines, right?
in mines. There were some in Hispaniola, which is today Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and the whole island of Hispaniola, which was where the first Spanish settlement was, did have slavery and did have a sugar industry, but it wasn't a modern plantation system as we would see later.
Now, you've already mentioned this, but please talk about this a bit more, because the age of revolution, Haitian Revolution, American Revolution, French Revolution, of the late 18th century and beginnings in the 19th, is why a sugar revolution came to Cuba.
Yeah.
And once it did, sugar production had never, Cuba took over sugar production
Right.
essentially for the
Yeah.
world.
Yeah.
And it has everything to do, doesn't it, with why slavery lasted so long in Cuba and almost nowhere else in the Spanish Empire.
Right. Exactly. So when the thing about sugar in the New War in the Caribbean is that there was one major producer of sugar that produced most of the sugar in the world, and then soil would get depleted or something else would happen, and then the baton would be passed to the next island. So it was Barbados, then it was Jamaica, then it became
Right.
Saint Domingue, and Saint Domingue, the world's largest producer of sugar, the pearl of the Antilles. The French Revolution begins in the metropole, and it reverberates throughout Haiti. There were slave rebellions and slave conspiracies in Haiti, even of course way before the French Revolution. Anyway, you get the beginning of this rebellion of the enslaved in August of 1791, and that becomes independent Haiti. The Cuban planters are just, they say one of them says the hour of our happiness has arrived. Yeah. We take advantage of this and we become what Haiti used to be.
Right.
Of course, the enslaved in Cuba saw it too, right? So they saw that, they heard all the news, or not all the news, but they heard so much news about what was going on in Saint Domingue. And
they're only 50 miles apart.
Right. In the east, but there were ships coming to Havana all the time from Saint Domingue, and there was a spate of rebellions and conspiracies in Cuba following the Haitian Revolution. Almost every year you had one. Some years, like 1795, you had multiple ones, 1811, and in almost all of them, it's interesting. The Spanish question all these potential witnesses or conspirators. And what the witnesses do, the enslaved witnesses, is they recount conversations amongst themselves. They say, well, this person told me we were going to do this and asked me to do this. And they're kind of a window into these conversations among the enslaved. And in so many of them, the example of Haiti comes up. So they say, we want to do what they did in Haiti. So the Haitian Revolution was tremendously important for sugar. It was also tremendously important because you talked about the age of revolution. Another part of the age of revolution is Latin American independence, and that whole movement that, that went on from roughly 1810 or 1808, depending on how you count, through 1825,
Right.
when when all of Spanish South America became independent. Cuba didn't, and one of the reasons is that the planters were profiting from slavery,
Right.
they were profiting from sugar, and they were worried that any kind of attempt at independence might produce the kind of social upheaval that had happened in Saint Domingue. And of course, the Spanish state took advantage of that and said,
Yes.
Cuba has to be Spanish or else it will be Haiti. And so it's hugely important.
It's a fascinating story because throughout the rest of the Spanish Empire, I guess, except maybe Puerto Rico, they
Right.
not only gained independence, but most of those countries even ended slavery
Yeah.
in the early 19th century. But
Or,
not
or
Cuba.
1850s, a lot of them.
Up to the 1850s,
Yeah,
between the 1820s and 1850s.
Right.
But not Cuba, because Cuba became the boom
Yeah.
sugar industry, and sugar industrialized too, right?
Yes,
I mean,
exactly.
sugar mills became these factories practically.
Yeah, they were some of them. They were the most modern plantations, sugar plantations in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah, and slavery didn't end until 1886, so very, very late in the 19th century.
But throughout that 19th century, and this is so persistent in Cuban history, there are numerous rebellions, there are numerous independence movements.
Mhm.
And Cuba becomes this lightning rod issue, is where the United States comes in again, for the US. No less than at least 3, maybe 4 US presidential administrations from about 1848 to the Civil War tried, one way or another, tried to annex Cuba.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, one administration after another. It was especially a big interest of Southern planters.
Yeah.
Northern abolitionists opposed it, but it was a very big issue in American politics that I think Americans don't always grasp.
They don't realize, as Thomas Jefferson said, the ideal map of the United States would include Canada on the north, and the US's southern border, he imagined, would be the southern coast of Cuba. So very early, way before the 1840s, American statesmen were already thinking that. There's this famous quote by John Quincy Adams, the one about the apple, where he says basically, Cuba is like an apple on a tree. And once the apple becomes ripe, it will be severed from the tree. And once it falls, it can only fall into our kind of eager embrace, or I forget the exact word used. So his assumption was always that Cuba would become American. There was a question of when, but not a question of if. And so that was it. That was in the early 1820s when there was consideration of annexing it. And then in the 1840s, Polk, others, Pierce, Buchanan, a little later, all of them tried to purchase it. Sometimes were even willing to go to war if it came to that. It didn't. It
was a standard impulse, especially of the Democratic Party in the 1850s. And just imagine, I mean, well, that's the point, isn't it? If you imagine the American South drawing Cuba into its fold, if a confederacy had seceded from the Union and it included the sugar power of Cuba.
Right.
And it almost happened. I mean,
it almost happened. And, and they wanted to, it's interesting because at the time, they weren't thinking of annexing it as a territory. They were thinking of annexing it as
statehood.
But not one state. At one point, they were thinking
divided
it was a Long Island, divided actually in 3. So they thought they would get 3. Right. I mean, different proposals said different things. Sometimes it was 2, but that would give them 3 new slave states. And they said, it was to balance to buttress the power of slavery and what they called the Federal Congress, right? That was completely the point of their interest.
Oh yeah. Well, some Democrats think we ought to divide California today and get 2 more senators too, but who knows? Anyway, but I mean, I'm moving too fast because this is such a rich history. I mean, Cuba plays such a role in the American Civil War. And the ties now, the business ties that begin to develop between Cuba and the U.S. Oh my goodness, U.S. banks, U.S. businessmen, their whole Cuban communities that develop in American cities, right, in
Right.
the 19th century. But then you have the 10 Years' War.
Yeah.
Talk about that a minute. What is the 10 Years' War? I don't think Americans know
No,
anything.
I don't think they, I think most people don't know about it. Just one quick thing I forgot to mention is that there were whole regions in Cuba, going back to the question of sugar and plantations, where a lot of the plantations were American owned.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So that's a very important point,
That
including
money's
by,
coming back to the U.S., right?
yep, exactly. And some of them are American senators and, all kinds of people own property there. And then send the profits back home to the US.
Offshore investments.
Exactly. So yeah, so in terms of the 10 Years' War, so the 10 Years' War was the first full-fledged independence war in Cuba. And it was begun in 1868 by a sugar planter in the East. The East had kind of smaller plantations. It wasn't the large modern plantations of Western Cuba. And he began by freeing about 40 people he held as slaves, and he offered them their freedom, and thus began the war. It lasted 10 years. They couldn't win. But one thing the war did was accelerate the end of slavery. So the rebels kind of freed slaves in rebel territory. The Spanish, realizing they couldn't hold off too much longer, began instituting some policies of gradual emancipation. And one of the other reasons the war is so interesting is because not only because it mobilizes enslaved people, but also that men of color become important figures in the battle for independence. So there are Black generals, some of them free people of color, some of them the sons of enslaved parents, and the most famous, of course, is Antonio Masayo,
right?
Who became such an important. I mean, he's one of Cuba's national heroes, obviously, but he was very well regarded in the U.S. and African Americans in particular, in the wars that would come later, really, recognized him as a hero and even named their sons after him. So
I was struck at that.
Yeah, they named them Masayo, but I mean, they called it Maceo, but it was in honor of Antonio Masayo. So that was the first war. It ended. They didn't win independence. There was a second war shortly after. I don't know if you want me to keep going with the wars.
Well, no, but I just wanted you to talk about it because it shows how deep and old these independence movements are in Cuba, such that when the Castro phenomenon happens much later in the 1950s, it's building on, as you point out in the book, the ultimate Cuban Revolution of 1959 is many other revolutions before it. It's a history of these revolutions that have succeeded here and failed there, and in many cases had terribly bloody repercussions, and ended up in one kind of dictator after another, but never completely breaking Spanish rule. So get us into the 20th. Let's get to the 20th century. An audience here is going to want
to. They've been so patient, but I think actually I'm gonna count 1895 as the 20th century.
Okay. That's the big independence. That's the big independence moment, and at least this American war with Spain.
Exactly.
And a lot of other problems that came out of that, right?
Exactly. So 1895 is the beginning of the final Cuban War of Independence, and I start there because that revolution. I mean, it's incredible for some of the same reasons as that I mentioned before. Slavery's already ended. There's this multiracial army called the Liberation Army. There's really important Black leaders. There's an important discourse of racial equality that becomes part of the movement. And I think that's really important to note, that the leaders talked, explicitly about the new Cuban Republic being founded on racial equality. So that was that's a very different kind of independence movement than you saw in the United States, even than what you saw in 1868. But that war it lasts 3 years. In 1898, it seems like the Cubans are very close to winning. They control most of the countryside. The Spanish are limited to the cities. The Americans think that the Spanish won't be able to win. So in the midst of all that, the Maine explodes in Havana Harbor, and the Maine, obviously a U.S. Ship, and the U.S. blames Spain and declares war on Spain and intervenes in Cuba and enters the war. So they win the war basically 3 months, about 3 or 4 months later, and then the U.S. doesn't leave. So it signs. And it's so interesting because you have this
Havana becomes a playground for America.
You have this whole 30-year struggle for Cuban independence, right, that most of the world doesn't know about. And then it becomes this 3-month Spanish-American War in which Cubans aren't even named, and the treaty that ended it, the Cubans weren't allowed to participate in the making of the treaty or the celebrations that happened when the Spanish, when the cities capitulated to the Americans, and so on. And then the Americans came in and occupied Cuba militarily. And that's the beginning of the 20th century. So there's the whole country is governed by a US general, a US military governor until 1902. And the Americans leave in 1902, but they make as a condition for their departure Cuban acceptance of the Platt Amendment. And basically the Platt Amendment, which I think many Americans don't know about. I don't think they study it in school very much anymore, but the Platt Amendment basically gave the US the right of intervention in Cuba. They could intervene militarily without the invitation of the Cuban government. It prohibited the Cuban government from incurring foreign debt, from signing treaties with foreign governments. It specified that the US would have land for naval bases and things like that. So that's the origin of Guantanamo as well.
Right, and it's sort of a brutal extension of the Monroe Doctrine.
Yes.
Really a century already as well.
Right.
That the Caribbean somehow belonged to the U.S.
Yeah.
No one in the Caribbean had ever been asked that. And again, we're leaving out a lot here. You end up, after the U.S. governing comes to a certain halt, the U.S. investment, U.S. business interest, U.S. tourism there not only didn't end, it exploded.
Yeah.
But then you get a series of dictators running Cuba, and Batista, the one overthrown finally in 1959, is only one of his whole series, right?
Yeah.
But let's get to, if we can, because I don't want to run out of time here. I have to say for the audience here, I mean, if you must buy this book, but one reason to buy it, if nothing else, is to read the chapters, the riveting, page-turning chapters here that Ada has written about the background and the rise of Fidel Castro. And not just Castro, but the whole phenomenon of the Cuban Revolution. Most Americans don't understand it. We tend to only see Cuba and Castro through a Cold War lens, depending on when we were born. And maybe through some lens of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but explain that as best you can.
Very briefly, yeah.
Well, who is Fidel, and where does this come from? And he failed a number of times until he didn't.
Right, exactly. So, who is Fidel Castro? Well, I mean, he was a very talented individual. And a master politician in many ways. Americans tend to think, as you said, of the revolution only as Fidel Castro and only as communist. And people at the time were kind of shocked that Fidel Castro and communism seemed to come out of nowhere, right?
Yeah.
But one of the things that I show in the book is that, first of all, that the revolution in the beginning was not Fidel Castro's revolution. There were many, many other people involved, from middle-class housewives to Catholic students to anti-communist students, all kinds of people were involved in the struggle against the Batista.
I was struck at how big the student movement was.
Oh, it was hugely important from earlier, from the 1920s, during another revolution against another dictator, but hugely important. And the student movement combined, left progressive politics, not some socialists, but not all socialists. Some of them were actually also anti-communist, but it combined that with a fervent kind of nationalism and anti-American imperialism. And that's one of the traditions that Fidel Castro comes from. So all the things that Fidel Castro and other revolutionaries were calling for were not communism. The people didn't make the revolution for it to become communist or because they wanted to be communists. They wanted an end to the Batista dictatorship. They wanted the restoration of a liberal constitution that he had upended in the 1940 Constitution. They were vehemently against government corruption. That was a major platform in the revolutionary movement. They were for things like workers' rights. They wanted an agrarian reform, which they then got in the revolution. But all those things were part of mainstream Cuban politics before Fidel Castro. He didn't come out of nowhere. He was a product of decades of activism and social and political movements that that were really powerful and that were also very focused on trying to limit U.S. influence and U.S. power on the island.
And I was struck too by the 50s, mid 50s and into the late 50s, just the sheer collective fervor against Batista and the corruption and the brutality of that regime was all across the society.
Yeah.
From the church to middle class intellectuals.
Right.
And yet Castro ends up leading this. I'm still not sure I can explain why, except that he was an amazing propagandist.
He was an amazing propagandist.
An amazing guerrilla warrior.
Yeah.
Once he managed to finally land and get up in those eastern mountains, and just a manipulator of the media.
Yeah, no, he was. And he even talked about it when he was in jail before, long before getting to the mountains, that propaganda would be key to any victory. And I think part of what happened, so the revolution was not communist in the beginning. He calls it publicly socialist for the first time in the midst of the Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961. So that's over 2 years. And I think there are many things that lead him to that position. First, when he takes power, some of the other really important leaders had been killed in the struggle. So he was kind of in some sense, he was the last man standing of the most powerful.
Yeah, Pais and some of these other names.
Yes,
you do a very good job of showing that there are many other leaders of this. Castro is the last, and he didn't kill them off.
No. So he's the last man standing. He comes to power, and the U.S. immediately tries to put all this in a Cold War frame, and he's trying to resist it initially. But I think in some sense, I think Castro was surprised by how popular the revolution became so quickly. So there was a survey done in February, it was non-scientific, by a popular magazine that was not, by then, at that point, the government did not control the media, so it was totally independent. A survey done in February 1959 that showed that over 92% of the Cuban population thought the new revolutionary government was doing everything perfectly well. And I think he saw the rallies, he saw the public mobilize to enact this agrarian reform. He saw the support pouring in, and it's almost like there's one speech which I think is it's not the speech that's incredible, it's the rally. It's the rally in May 1959 for the it's in July 59 to celebrate the agrarian reform. And he sees the peasants clanking their machetes in support, and you can see it in his eyes. You can see kind of the wonder at what he's done in his eyes. So it's almost like he knew he could push forward. He knew he could make it more radical, and he kept going. The Americans kept kind of serving his purpose by making it all about, the Cold War. And
I was struck about that one rally. I don't remember which one,
Yeah.
But he keeps being asked, when are you going to have elections? When are you going to have elections? So
Yeah.
he started asking these massive
Yeah.
crowds, do you want elections? And they say, no, we don't want
Yeah.
elections. We
Yeah.
want you.
So I think it's a fascinating period, that first year and a half. Yeah.
And the reforms, all these laws they can
Yeah.
you point out that, I don't know, what they do? They enacted 1,500 laws in 1 month.
Yeah. In like,
But they start
9 months. Yeah.
They start literacy programs. They
Yeah.
start programs for children, programs
Yeah.
for teachers, the teaching of peasants, healthcare programs.
Yeah.
They have this thing called Year of Maternity, which is all about making women have babies, I guess. And then a harvest celebration. I mean,
Yeah.
this was stuff that obviously made people feel good about their futures.
Yeah.
And you know, this gets to where I know Alex is going to tell us we have to wrap up here and go to Q&A, but you said this at the outset, and I want to get you to reflect on this because it's what happened to your family.
Yeah.
Once this revolution occurs, you get millions of Cubans who experience revolution. I mean, what is a revolution? This was a revolution.
Yeah. Yeah.
All of its forms. It's got incredible violence. It's
Yeah.
got resistance. It's got guerrilla war. It's got overthrow of a regime, et cetera.
Yeah.
And what does revolution do to people's mentalities?
Yeah.
And talk about that a bit, because
Yeah. I mean, that's
there's a lot here, and I think it's in the end one of the great themes of your book.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, when I teach a course on Cuba, I ask students to pretend they're writing an article called The Cuban Revolution, and then I ask them to put, or comma, and then to put dates. So basically what I'm asking them is to determine what the end date of the Cuban Revolution is, right? You know, other revolutions we think of as having end dates, the Mexican Revolution, the French Revolution, the Russian, you know, Haiti, et cetera.
The American Revolution had a treaty. It was over.
Right, exactly. So, but what the Cuban Revolution did was to talk about the revolution in a way that made the revolution seem permanent. And so even today they talk about defending the revolution as defending the current government. So for me, one of the things that I try to figure out, I mean, I don't talk about it this way explicitly in the book, but is when did the Cuban Revolution stop being a revolution? Because I don't, you know, Cuban society today is not a revolutionary society. I don't think, you know, when the Soviet Union collapsed and all these reforms were enacted, it was not a revolutionary society. Right. So when did it stop being?
It almost ceased to exist when the Soviet Union died.
Exactly. So, and I think, you know, I think by 1976, when it enacts a new socialist constitution, I think it's already not a revolutionary society. It's an established one-party state in which things have become institutionalized, and there's no longer anything near. That doesn't mean there's not support, but there's no longer that kind of fervor that you think of as inherent to revolution. So, so I would say that.
Well, and I can't help saying too, you handle in one quite wonderful chapter the Cuban Missile Crisis. You call it the brink.
Yeah.
Which is what a lot of scholars call it as well. But Cuba was, you know, was in an existential crisis of not all its own making, but in the middle of it.
Yeah.
And what a turning point that became. And what a memory that must have left.
Right.
In Castro, his people, and I mean,
I loved writing that chapter. It was one of the chapters I most dreaded writing because so much has been written about it, but I ended up loving it. And part of what I tried to do in that chapter and in the Bay of Pigs chapter is just to make sure that the reader's attention focuses on Cuba. There's a way to narrate the Bay of the missile crisis as, you know, the 13 days, Khrushchev and Castro, I'm sorry, Khrushchev and Kennedy. And
the blockade.
Yeah, so I start the chapter in the town that's right near where the missiles are first going. And I have Cubans looking out their louvered windows, trying to figure out what these trucks in the middle of the night are bringing in. So again, think about like the people who live there and how they experience revolution and these world historical events, right? The history with a big H shapes individual lives and the lives of family and everyday life. And I wanted to get at that intersection between that, what you called the big epic history and individual lives and
Well,
everyday.
you have a lot of individual lives in this book. In fact, I made a list, and we don't have time to go through it.
Yeah.
But I do want to say this to readers who are now going to buy this book. You're going to get introduced to some people you've never heard of. But my God, does ought to make them fascinating. This guy named Hatway, did I pronounce that?
Hatway, yes, the
Oh
Taino.
my goodness, very early in the book. I mean,
Yeah.
what a
Yeah.
personality he was, or for that matter, Jose Marti, one of the
Yes.
greatest Cuban writers, who spends most of his life in New York.
And he's a New Yorker. He's a New Yorker.
I know, but he's very much a Cuban writer.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then I mean, Aponte, this leader who is a legendary leader in Cuba, and on and on and on. And then there's the Virgin of Charity.
Yes.
Whoever she was, well, maybe she wasn't, but she's the symbol of Cuba, right?
Right.
I mean, there's a rich cultural history here too, that we don't have time to go into, but I know we do have a bunch of questions out there. So how about Alex, over to you, and we'll let Ada field some good questions here about all the things we didn't get to cover.
Sure. Thank you, David. Thank you, Ada. To our audience members out there, if you would like to purchase a copy of the book, please look in the chat room. I've provided a link there, or simply head to midtownscholar.com. And we're going to enter the audience Q&A portion of the event. So if you have a question, please use the Q&A button towards the bottom of the screen. It's below our faces here. All right, so we got about 10 minutes here. I'm happy to go through some of these questions. This one is from Matthew. Matthew says, to what extent is it necessary or even appropriate for historians of Cuba to involve themselves in current policy debates? And even David would be happy for you to jump in there. And for historians of a particular field, how involved should they be in current events?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one thing is that we're constantly asked to comment on these current events. So sometimes.
And predict.
And predict. Yes, you're asked to comment on current events and then explain what will happen next, and which all historians hate. I think it is important. I think there is a way for historians to weigh in on contemporary events. For example, when the recent protests happened in Cuba, you had some in the U.S. calling for intervention, for liberation, for people talked about freeing Cuba and all that. And I think it's important to know that the discourse of liberating Cuba is an old discourse. We've seen it since the 19th century, and it was a discourse that was not really ever about liberating Cuba. So I think understanding what came before, it won't tell you what to do, but I think it can tell you things to avoid and it can signal how particular ways of talking about things will backfire. For an American politician to talk about the liberation of Cuba, it may sound one way to him, but it's going to sound completely different to people who know these histories of intervention and so on. So I think that is one way that historians can talk, have a role to play in these contemporary discussions.
Well said. We warn.
Yes, we warn. We're good at warning. That won't work. Yeah.
Our next question comes from Judith. Judith is just curious about what the Cuban reactions have been to maybe this book or your other books or your research.
Yeah. Well, this book just came out, so I don't know about this one. But my first two books didn't deal with the revolutionary period. They were colonial or late colonial, and they've been very well received in Cuba and positively reviewed. Actually, both of them have been translated and into Spanish and published in Cuba. So so people there are able to read my work in Spanish, and I meet people who've read it quite often. And that's, which is a great thing to be able to write about a place and have people there read it.
This next question comes from Mariana. Mariana writes, I can't wait to read the book. Can you briefly describe how it perhaps goes against the grain of other histories of Cuba, recent or otherwise, and what versions or narratives are you pushing up against?
Mm.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, there's so many things I could say. I think that if general histories of Cuba tend not to be written this way. They tend to be written more as textbooks or as kind of great men history. And I explicitly tried not to write this book this way. So there are great men in the book, right? I mean, there's the King of Spain or Cuban president or Fidel Castro, those people are obviously in the book. But, as I just mentioned with the missile crisis, I always try to draw readers' attention to what ordinary people might have experienced living through this history. So I think that's one way it goes against the grain. I think another way is that most histories of Cuba that are general histories of Cuba perhaps pay a little less, they maybe give slavery and Black Cubans a less prominent place perhaps than this one does. And then finally, I think that this one is different precisely because it also tries to make a claim that Cuban history is a way to understand American history as well.
And and on that note, just a very quick point, Ada, there's a lot in this book that helps us understand the way race is conceived in Cuba.
Yeah.
Not always the same way as it is here.
Exactly.
I mean, that's important.
Yeah. Yeah, the idea is, maybe readers shouldn't take so much for granted and should unsettle some of our assumptions. And I learned a lot writing the book, which is always fun too.
This next question comes from Olivia. It's a little long and particular, but I think it's good and worth it. So hold on tight. Going back to the 10 Years' War, could you talk about why Cuban American transnational rebels in the war, who were deeply connected to American sugar interests, would lead in the destruction and burning of sugar and coffee during the war? Also, were Cuban transnationals during the 10 Years' War period more interested in independence or in annexation, since slavery in the US had ended by that time?
Yeah. There were debates among the rebels about the extent to which to destroy sugar and burn sugar, but they realized that to make war you have to destroy things and you have to burn things. You have to be a threat. And so, especially in the final war, when the rebels leave the East and march into the West, and they're entering sugar plantations, they're recruiting the workforces, many of whom are the young sons of formerly enslaved women, and they're burning sugarcane. And one of the chants that you hear, or that people used in the war was no freedom, no cane. Actually, that was earlier for the 10 Years' War and slavery. But this idea that burning the cane is a way to kind of leverage your power. That's part of it. That's always been part of the history of revolutionary struggle and political struggle in Cuba. During the revolution, the Americans would send planes and exile pilots would send planes to bomb sugar fields, to burn sugarcane. It was a form of sabotage. So it's always been a central part of attacking the powers that be. I think that in terms of annexation or independence, there was some talk initially of annexation in 1868, but by and large, the major goal was independence. I don't think that there's that becomes clear by throughout the war, and definitely in the final war.
This next question comes from Arthur. Arthur says, is there a correlation between the US reaction to Haiti after the French were overthrown and Cuba after Castro by Batista?
Yeah, that's a great question. I sometimes use that in a Caribbean history final exam, where I say Haiti is to the 19th century what Cuba is to the 20th. Explain, and by talking about domestic policy, international affairs. Yes, absolutely. I mean, the response to the Haitian Revolution among world powers, including the US, which was not quite yet a world power, was containment. They wanted to limit its influence, to starve its, to limit its influence. In the case of Cuba in 1959, especially by 1960, the US wanted to limit its influence in the rest of Latin America, to limit the power of the Soviets in Cuba, which it soon realized it was too late to do. And then also literally to starve it when it enacted the US economic embargo that Eisenhower began and that then Kennedy really codified. So yes, I think there's a lot of parallel between those two cases.
You know, speaking of Eisenhower, I didn't know this. I was struck at what in your book, how you talk about Eisenhower's initial response to Fidel.
Yeah.
It was a good thing. Good.
Yeah.
Got rid of it.
Yeah.
A year later, not so good. But
Not so good.
Interesting. Yeah. Go ahead, Alex. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. We have time for just a couple more questions here, then we've got to wrap up. But this one's from Margaret. This is about your research. Margaret says, thank you for sharing your work. Can you share a bit about what documents you turn to for a record of oral history and popular memory in the making of your book?
Yeah. Well, I mean, because most of my work is before this was an older history, I didn't use oral history or memory. I mean, I did some. I would hear people's recollections of, for example, one of the, David mentioned the personal voice. One of the first stories that my mother told me, which is in the book, is how when she was growing up, there was a couple in her small town, a formerly enslaved man and a formerly enslaved woman, and they used to kind of gather the neighborhood children and tell them stories. And he would talk about fighting in the wars of independence, and she would talk about buying her freedom, or I can't remember if it was buying or acquiring it somehow right now. But so I do turn to some stories like that, but it has not been a major part of my work for this book, because it's more, it's much more part of it is much more modern than my old work. I used a lot of memoirs and diaries and collections of letters, but I did some interviews, some formal interviews with people, but it wasn't a major part of the book.
Our last question this evening, this one's from Molly. Molly says, relations between the US and Cuba were improving under the Obama administration, lifting the trade embargo, easing travel restrictions, only to have the Trump administration put them back in place. And they're curious, I know this is a current events question again, but what can we expect for US and Cuba relations under the Biden administration?
Well, it's interesting. I definitely expected more than what we've seen to date. So some people expected him to possibly, Obama didn't quite lift the embargo because the Congress took that power away from the executive in the 1990s. So only Congress can lift the embargo on Cuba, something that Congress is not likely to do. I think Obama's expectation, of course, was that Hillary Clinton would succeed him and that perhaps the Democrats would win and then maybe they would lift the embargo. But I don't think lifting the embargo was ever Biden's goal. And in 2020, the Democratic Party platform did not include lifting the embargo, which is interesting because it was in the Democratic Party platform for, from elections prior, but he specifically removed it. So I don't think that was ever his intention. I did expect him to ease some of Trump's restrictions. He didn't get to it right away because he had a lot on his plate, and I don't know that he was that interested in doing it. And then of course the protests happened, and then I think politically it would have been hard for him in that moment to ease up because he would have been seen as rewarding the Cuban government. But I think there are things he can do. He can lift restrictions on remittances. I think he can work with allies. I think working alone, which is what the embargo essentially has never functioned. And so I think he can work with allies and develop a more multilateral policy that is, that's more rational than Cuba policy has been. There was an American diplomat, Wayne Smith, in Havana, who was in Havana for under Carter, and he said that Cuba had the effect on Americans that the moon did on werewolves. Like they just the discussions of policy just they make no sense. They're not rational. So I don't expect them to get rational in the near future, unfortunately.
Alex, if I may, just a
Sure.
quick comment, less a question again, but for readers out there, you have a chance here, Ada, don't worry. You have a chance here to see a master historian at work. And what I mean by that is the way a historian manages to take this massive amount of information over 5-6 centuries and make decisions about how to put it into pieces, and it's written in short chapters. You were obviously very careful about that. I could see you at work trying to keep the narrative moving of a very big story, but doing it in these short
nuggets. Yeah.
No, I think it worked. And
Yeah.
you have a great skill with that narrative opening in each chapter. It's an incredibly readable book, and I just wanted to say that.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Ada. This has been just a really wonderful evening, a wonderful conversation. Again, the book is Cuba, An American History. Head to our website, midtownscholar.com. There it is. Look in the chat room. I provided a link there. Thank you to our audience members. Thank you for your questions. We had some great questions tonight. We see you. We appreciate you. David, we got to get you back to Harrisburg sometime.
I'm ready. I don't have a new book yet, but stay tuned.
Hey, we'll get you back here no matter what.
All right.
Well, thank you, Alex, and thank you, David, and to everyone for your questions and your interest in the work. I really appreciate it.
Of course. Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.
Take care, everybody. See you, Ada.